The auditorium was buzzing with excitement that evening. People whispered to each other, flipping through programs, their eyes glinting with anticipation. The stage lights cast a warm glow on the polished wooden floor, reflecting softly on the grand piano at the center. Everyone was waiting for the famous pianist who had performed in halls all over the world. She was elegant, confident, and fearless, and she carried an air that made everyone feel both thrilled and a little intimidated. But that night, the spotlight wasn't meant for her. It was meant for a young pianist who had just arrived in the city, carrying nothing but a small suitcase, a notebook full of music, and a heart full of hope. She had grown up far from big concert halls, far from crowds that clapped in standing ovations, and far from the world of people who judged talent like it was a currency. Yet she had practiced every single day of her life, often until her fingers ached and her back was sore. Driven by a love for music that no criticism could ever touch, she walked onto the stage, trying to calm the storm of nerves in her chest. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the bench and lifted the lid of the piano. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze. Some faces were kind, encouraging even, but many were skeptical. They had come to see a show, to be impressed by the well-known stars of the music world. They weren't expecting someone like her, someone who was quiet, unpolished, and still learning to believe in herself. Then she noticed her. The famous pianist sat in the front row, her posture perfect, her expression sharp, like a hawk studying its prey. She didn't applaud or smile. Instead, she leaned slightly to whisper something to the person beside her, her eyes flicking toward the young girl at the piano. The young pianist felt a pang in her chest. She had heard stories about this woman. Critics called her talent unmatched. Students at the academy whispered about her sharp tongue, her cutting remarks that could make even the most confident musician feel small. And now she was here, in the same room, watching her. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself why she had come. Music was her language, her way of speaking when words weren't enough. She had traveled a long way, and she would not let fear or judgment stop her tonight. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play dot. At first, the notes were cautious, tentative, as if testing the waters. Her hands remembered every hour she had spent practicing alone in a tiny room, her fingers learning the paths of the keys like old friends. Slowly, the music began to grow, filling the auditorium with something tender, something vulnerable yet strong. People leaned forward, drawn in by the sincerity of her playing. It wasn't perfect, not technically flawless like the famous pianist they had seen on television, but it was real, and it carried emotion that no perfect note could ever capture. Then she heard it. A soft laugh, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. She glanced toward the front row and saw it. The famous pianist, smiling in a way that wasn't kind, a hint of mockery in her eyes. She whispered something again, just loud enough for a few people nearby to catch the words. She's trying, but she's not ready. The young pianist felt her stomach drop. A wave of embarrassment rushed through her, hot and sharp. She felt exposed, like every mistake, every shaky note was being broadcast for the world to judge. Her fingers faltered, hitting a few wrong notes. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it didn't matter. That this was about her music, not about the approval of one person, no matter how famous. But the words echoed in her mind. For a moment, everything felt heavy. The stage felt too big, the lights too bright, the audience too critical. She wanted to run, to hide, to go back to her small room where no one could see her struggle. But then she closed her eyes and remembered why she had started playing the piano in the first place. She remembered the nights she had spent alone, music pouring from her soul because she had no other way to express herself. She remembered the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, the way a single note could make her heart swell or break. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and continued. Slowly, carefully, she let the music flow again. This time, it wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about proving anything to the famous pianist in the front row or to anyone else. It was about telling her story through the piano. Each note was a word, each chord a sentence, each melody a paragraph in the story of her life. She played with honesty, letting the pain, the fear, and the hope come through. Somewhere in the audience, people began to notice. They leaned forward, drawn in by the raw emotion. They felt her struggle, her determination, her courage to keep going despite the fear. The hall that had felt cold and judgmental before now felt alive with connection. Every note she played reached someone, touching hearts in a way that no technical skill alone could, and yet, the young pianist could still feel the famous pianist's eyes on her, sharp and calculating. She imagined the whisper again, the quiet judgment that seemed to float above her head. But this time, instead of letting it crush her, she used it. She let it sharpen her focus, let it remind her why she had worked so hard. The mockery became a challenge, a fire that pushed her to give everything she had in this performance. The final chords approached, and her hands moved with confidence she hadn't felt at the start. She played them fully, without hesitation, letting them resonate in the hall long after the last note had been struck. There was silence for a heartbeat, a collective pause where the audience seemed to catch its breath, holding on to the echo of her music. Then the applause began, at first gentle, then growing louder and louder until it filled the entire auditorium. People stood, clapping and cheering, moved not just by the notes she had played, but by the courage behind them. The young pianist sat there, breathing heavily, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of relief and pride, joy and exhaustion. She had faced fear, embarrassment, and doubt, and she had kept going. She had played her heart out, and for the first time, it felt like her music had truly been heard. The famous pianist in the front row was still watching. Her expression had changed slightly. The smirk was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Maybe curiosity, maybe a flicker of respect. The young pianist didn't need her approval, not anymore. She had found her own strength, and that was more powerful than any praise or criticism from someone else. After the recital, people came up to her, praising her performance, asking questions, and sharing how deeply the music had affected them. Some were students, some were musicians, some were simply people who loved music. Everyone had felt something from her playing, and that feeling was hers alone to give that night. As she walked home through the quiet streets, carrying only her small suitcase and the weight of her own emotions, she smiled. She knew the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more critics, more challenges, and more moments of doubt. But she also knew something else. She had the courage to face them. She had learned that music could speak when words failed, and that even in the face of mockery, she could rise, one note at a time, and so, under the soft glow of the streetlights, with the sounds of the city around her, she made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to play, not for fame, not for approval, but for the love of music, for the truth in her heart, and for the power that one song could hold to change everything. After that first recital, the young pianist returned to her small apartment with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. The applause and kind words from the audience still echoed in her mind, but so did the sharp look and quiet mockery from the famous pianist. She tried to push it away, telling herself that what mattered was her music, not someone else's judgment. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the city's noises faded to distant hums, doubt crept in. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They had carried her dreams for so long, moving over piano keys with a combination of discipline and passion. And yet she wondered if they were enough. Could they ever be enough to reach a world that seemed so big, so filled with talent she could barely measure against? The applause had felt like magic, yes, but so had the cold, cutting eyes that had followed her every note. The next few weeks were not easy. She tried to practice, as she always had, but each note felt heavier, each chord more difficult. Her fingers hesitated, her rhythm faltered, and she found herself replaying the famous pianist's whisper in her mind over and over. She's trying, but she's not ready. Every time she tried to focus, those words returned, like an echo in an empty hall, erasing confidence before it could take root. Friends and neighbors noticed her struggle. A kind neighbor, who often stopped by to listen while she played, offered encouraging words. "You played with so much heart," they said. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." But even those gentle reminders felt distant. The young pianist wanted to believe them. She really did. But inside, there was a storm she could not calm. She felt small, ordinary, and for the first time in her life, uncertain about the path she had chosen. Some days she didn't touch the piano at all. She would sit in her apartment, staring out the window at the street below, listening to the muffled sounds of life outside, and wonder if she was chasing a dream that belonged to someone else. Music, which had always been her refuge, now felt like a reminder of all the things she couldn't do perfectly. She would pick up her notebook, write down a few ideas, and then close it again. Frustrated that her thoughts sounded empty and meaningless, it was during one of these long, quiet afternoons that she remembered something her music teacher had once told her. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest. She had nodded at the time, barely understanding the depth of the words. Now, however, sitting alone and listening to the silence of her apartment, she realized she had forgotten that truth. She had been trying so hard to prove something to others, to reach standards she didn't even fully believe in herself, that she had lost sight of why she played in the first place. That realization didn't solve everything immediately. Of course, doubt is a persistent companion, and it doesn't leave at the first sign of clarity. She still struggled with each practice session. Some days she would play for only a few minutes before giving up, frustrated by a single mistake. Other days she would play for hours, but the sound felt hollow, as if the piano were just an object and not an extension of her own heart. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, she began to find a rhythm again. She experimented with melodies, allowed her fingers to wander, and stopped worrying about whether the notes were perfect. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of the old joy that had made her fall in love with the piano. One evening, while cleaning the small shelf in her apartment, she came across an old, worn composition she had once scribbled down in her notebook. She had forgotten about it entirely. The melody was simple, almost plain, but when she played it, something inside her stirred. It was as if the music had been waiting for her all along, a reminder of her own voice, her own story. She played the piece again and again, letting the notes sink into her chest, letting them carry all the fear, frustration, and hope she had been holding on to. That night, something changed. She stayed at the piano until her fingers ached, but she didn't feel exhaustion. She felt alive, connected to something larger than herself, a rhythm that belonged to her and her alone. The music was no longer about proving herself to the world. It was about being honest with herself, about letting the piano speak when words failed. And as she played, she felt a tiny, fragile hope take root, the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could rise again. The days turned into weeks, and with each session at the piano, her confidence grew. Not the kind of confidence that comes from applause or recognition, but the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing your own worth, from trusting that your voice matters. She still remembered the famous pianist's mocking eyes. But now, instead of shrinking, she used that memory to fuel her determination. She told herself that if she could survive that moment, she could survive anything. She began to perform in small gatherings, places where people didn't care about fame or perfection. Friends invited her to local events, community centers, and even private homes just to share her music. Each time, she felt the same mix of nerves and excitement that she had felt at her first recital. But now she also felt something new, control. She could choose how to play, what to express, and how to connect with her audience. And each time she played, she felt a little more certain that she was on the right path. One rainy afternoon, she was practicing a new piece when she noticed something remarkable. The mistakes she had once feared so much, the wrong notes, the uneven rhythm, had begun to feel like part of the music, part of her story. They were no longer flaws, but expressions of something real, something human. She realized that the fear of being judged had been heavier than the mistakes themselves. Once she let go of that fear, the music flowed naturally. She laughed quietly to herself, marveling at the irony. The very thing she had feared was now helping her grow, even in these moments of progress. There were setbacks. There were mornings when she woke up and didn't want to touch the piano, when doubt clawed at her and reminded her that the world was full of better, faster, more talented musicians. But she had learned a small, powerful truth. The world might judge, but she didn't have to live by those judgments. Music at its heart was about connection, emotion, and courage. And courage, she realized, wasn't the absence of fear, it was playing anyway. Her family noticed the change too. They had watched her struggle silently, worried that her dream might crumble under the weight of criticism and self-doubt. Now, they saw a young woman who was learning to believe in herself, who could sit at a piano and let her feelings pour out without hesitation. They cheered quietly from the sidelines, offering gentle encouragement but mostly giving her space to grow. That support, combined with her own persistence, became the foundation for the transformation that was slowly taking shape. As the weeks turned into months, she began to compose her own music again, inspired by the struggles and victories she had experienced. Each piece was a reflection of her journey, the fear, the doubt, the moments of quiet triumph, and the sparks of hope that refused to fade. She realized that music was not just about skill or recognition, it was a mirror of life itself. With all its imperfections and beauty, one evening after hours of practice, she sat back at the piano and listened to the music she had created. It wasn't perfect, and that was exactly the point. Each note carried her story, her resilience, and her determination. She realized that the path she was on was not about fame, applause, or the judgment of others. It was about honesty, courage, and the power to express herself, no matter what anyone else thought. And so, even as the famous pianist's words still lingered in her mind, they no longer had power over her. They had been transformed into motivation, a reminder of how far she had come and how far she could still go. The young pianist knew that the journey ahead would have challenges. But she also knew that she had discovered something far more important than recognition. She had discovered her own strength, her own voice, and her own music. That strength would carry her forward. The struggles, the doubts, and the mockery had not defeated her. They had shaped her, preparing her for the moment when one song could change everything. And though she did not yet know what that moment would be, she felt it coming like a gentle current beneath the surface, ready to lift her to heights she had only dreamed of. With that quiet confidence, she closed her eyes and played one last piece before bed, letting the music carry her into sleep. It was no longer about proving herself to anyone else. It was about the pure, simple joy of playing, the connection between her heart and the keys, and the hope that she could continue to grow, no matter what the future held. And in that moment she felt at peace, ready to face the next chapter of her journey, one note, one song, and one small triumph at a time. After weeks of struggling and slowly finding her confidence again, the young pianist began to notice something different about her own music. It wasn't just the way the notes flowed or how her fingers moved across the keys. It was something deeper, something she had never felt before. Her music was starting to feel like her, in a way that no one else could copy. One evening, she was cleaning her apartment when she noticed a dusty, old composition tucked in the corner of her desk. She hadn't seen it in years. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged in places, but the melody still sang to her heart. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was worth revisiting. She hadn't composed anything in months, afraid that her music would never be good enough. But something about this old piece called to her, a small voice saying, "Try again." "This is yours." She placed it on the piano stand and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. At first the melody was awkward, clumsy even. But as she played, something began to change. The notes that once felt rigid now began to flow like water, soft and alive. Her fingers moved with a freedom she hadn't known in months, and suddenly the music didn't feel like practice or a performance. It felt like breathing. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel the music completely. Each note carried a memory, a moment, a part of her story. The mistakes she had once feared became part of the music, giving it character and depth. The melody rose and fell like her own heartbeat, carrying both her struggles and her hope. Hours passed unnoticed as she played, lost in the world she created with her own hands. As she played, she remembered the famous pianist who had mocked her so publicly. At first, that memory stung, as it always did. But now, instead of shrinking under the weight of judgment, she let it fuel her determination. If someone had doubted her in that way, then she would prove to herself, not to them, that she was capable. The music was no longer a source of fear. It was a source of strength. That night she stayed at the piano long after the city outside had gone quiet. The rain tapped gently on the window, a soft rhythm that matched the song she was composing. Her fingers moved faster now, more confident, more sure. She experimented with chords, added pauses, and let silence speak between the notes. The music began to tell a story she hadn't even known she wanted to tell, a story of struggle, resilience, and the small victories that made life worth living when she finally stopped. Her hands ached, but her heart felt light. She realized that she had done something incredible. She had transformed doubt into creativity, fear into art. The music on the piano wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was real, and in that honesty, she felt a joy she hadn't known since she first began playing as a child. The next few days were filled with practice and discovery. She played the piece over and over, experimenting with tempo, rhythm, and emotion. Each time she discovered something new, a subtle chord that made her smile, a pause that made her heart skip a beat. She began to record herself, listening carefully to each version, noting what felt right and what didn't. Slowly, the composition grew from a simple melody into something larger, something that told a complete story. Her confidence grew in ways she hadn't expected. She began to smile again while playing, to move her body with the music, to really feel it. Friends noticed the change too. They would stop by, curious to hear what she was working on, and were struck by the depth and emotion in her music. One friend, who had once told her that she was too hard on herself, remarked, "I think you're finally letting the real you shine through." That simple comment made her laugh softly, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in weeks. And yet, despite the growing excitement within her, there was a quiet tension that lingered. She knew that the world outside her apartment was still judging, still full of expectations. The memory of the famous pianist's mocking eyes haunted her sometimes, a reminder of how easily confidence could crumble. But now she met that fear with a gentle determination. She reminded herself that she had come too far to let anyone's opinion define her. She played for herself first, and the rest would follow. One afternoon, as she was playing the piece for the 100th time, something remarkable happened. She felt the music lift off the keys, filling the room in a way that made her feel as if she was not just playing, but speaking directly to the world. Every chord resonated with emotion, every pause carried meaning, every note seemed to whisper her story to anyone who would listen. She felt alive, truly alive, in a way she had never experienced before. It was then she realized something important. She had found her voice. Not the voice that critics would applaud or that the famous pianist might someday acknowledge, but her own voice. And with it came the power to create, to inspire, and to reach others in a way she had only dreamed of. The realization made her chest swell with pride and anticipation. She knew she was on the edge of something big, something transformative. Encouraged by this discovery, she began to play in front of small audiences again. She chose places where she could feel comfortable, where people came to listen, not to judge. Community halls, friends' gatherings, even small coffee shops. Each performance was a chance to test her music, to feel it resonate outside the walls of her apartment. And each time she noticed the effect it had. People smiled, closed their eyes, nodded along, or whispered softly to themselves. She realized that the music was no longer just hers. It was something she could share, something that could touch others in unexpected ways. Despite the small victories, she never allowed herself to become complacent. She continued to refine the composition, experimenting with dynamics, tempo, and emotion. She would stop and listen, replay, adjust, and play again, driven by a desire to make the music feel alive. Every day brought new discoveries, small sparks of inspiration that kept her moving forward. And with each practice session, her confidence grew, solidifying in a way that no applause or recognition could ever give. One evening, after hours of playing, she leaned back from the piano and looked at her reflection in the window. The girl who had walked into the first recital, trembling and uncertain, seemed like a distant memory. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had faced doubt, fear, and criticism, and had emerged with something real, something powerful. She felt proud, not because she had conquered someone else, but because she had conquered her own hesitation, her own fear. The breakthrough wasn't just in the music itself. It was in her understanding of herself. She realized that talent alone was not enough. Courage, perseverance, and honesty were equally important. She had learned to listen not just to the notes, but to the feelings behind them. She had learned that mistakes were not failures, but part of the journey. And she had learned that music, when played from the heart, could transcend judgment, criticism, and doubt. With this new understanding, she began to see her path more clearly. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges, more critics, and more moments of fear. But she now had something stronger than fear. She had belief in herself, in her music, and in the power of one song to carry her forward. She knew that if she stayed true to herself, kept playing with honesty and courage, she could reach places she had never imagined. That night, as she played the final notes of her composition, she felt a sense of completion and readiness. The journey she had begun, full of doubt and struggle, had led her to a moment of clarity. She knew that her music was no longer just an expression of practice or effort. It was a living, breathing story of resilience, courage, and hope. And in that quiet apartment, under the soft glow of the lamp, she smiled. She was ready for the next step, ready to share her music with a larger audience, and ready for the moment when one song might change everything. The day finally arrived when the young pianist was invited to perform at a bigger stage. It was the same music academy where she had first been humiliated by the famous pianist. The memories of that night, the whispered words, and the mocking smile were still tucked in the corners of her mind, but now they felt different. They didn't weigh her down, they pushed her forward. She had grown stronger, braver, and more certain of her music and herself. She arrived early, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. The hall was vast, with rows of seats stretching farther than her eyes could reach. Lights hung from above, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The audience began filling the seats slowly, their conversations creating a soft hum that made her stomach flutter. She could see teachers, students, and music lovers finding their places, many of them unaware of the story she carried with her. Backstage, she adjusted her dress, touched the piano keys lightly, and took several deep breaths. Every inhale reminded her of the countless hours she had spent practicing, the nights she had cried, the moments she had wanted to give up but didn't. Every exhale reminded her of the music that had carried her through those days, the melodies that had spoken her truth when words were not enough. She felt her hands tingling with anticipation, her heart beating faster than the clock ticking on the wall. She peeked at the front row and saw her, the famous pianist, sitting in her usual posture, sharp eyes scanning the stage. This time there was no smirk. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something else, a hint of tension, a flicker of expectation. It made the young pianist's chest tighten. She knew this performance would not only be about the music, but also about facing the judgment she had feared for so long. The stage manager nodded, signaling her turn. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the grand piano. Every step felt like a heartbeat, every heartbeat echoing the hours of struggle, practice, and growth she had endured. She took her seat, adjusted the bench, and lifted the lid. The audience hushed instantly, sensing the beginning of something special. She placed her fingers on the keys and began. The first notes were soft, tentative, like whispers in the dark, testing the space. But then, as the melody unfolded, her confidence grew. She played with precision, yes, but more importantly, with feeling. Each note carried the journey she had walked, the doubt, the tears, the small victories, and the quiet resilience that had kept her moving forward. The music was no longer just sound. It was a story, and every person in the hall could feel it. The famous pianist leaned forward slightly. She was no longer the intimidating presence she had been months ago. Her eyes were focused, attentive, and her lips pressed together in concentration. The young pianist didn't let her gaze shake her. Instead, she let it remind her of how far she had come, of the strength she had discovered in herself. As the performance continued, the music swelled and softened, rose and fell like a living thing. People in the audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward, closing their eyes, letting the sound reach them. Some felt tears prick their eyes, some smiled softly, and some simply sat in awe, taken by the honesty and emotion that radiated from the piano. The young pianist realized in that moment that this was why she had endured everything, the reason she had refused to give up. Music was not about fame, not about perfection, not about proving herself to anyone. It was about connection, about touching hearts in ways words never could. Halfway through the piece, a particularly emotional section arrived. Her fingers flew across the keys with fluidity and strength, yet she allowed pauses to linger, letting silence speak as powerfully as sound. She could feel the audience leaning in, listening to every nuance, every tremble of emotion. Her heart raced, but not with fear. It raced with joy, with freedom, with the knowledge that she was fully herself in this moment. The hall was silent except for the piano, yet in that silence she could feel the energy of everyone present. It was almost tangible, as if the music had formed an invisible bridge between her heart and theirs. And then she noticed it. The famous pianist's expression had softened. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time there was no judgment, no mockery, only admiration, perhaps even respect. The young pianist didn't let it distract her, though. She poured everything into the final movements, letting the music surge and crash, then settle gently like waves returning to shore. Her fingers danced over the keys with precision and passion, and when the last note rang out, it lingered in the air, heavy with emotion. The audience held its breath for a heartbeat, savoring the resonance, the story, the courage it had taken to reach this moment. Then came the applause. At first it was hesitant, a ripple of sound moving through the hall. Then it grew, louder and louder, until it filled every corner of the room. People stood, clapping and cheering, many with tears in their eyes. She could feel the energy rushing toward her, waves of appreciation and awe washing over her. She had never experienced anything like it. The music that had once been a refuge, a way to hide her fears, had now become a voice that people listened to, a force that moved them. She looked toward the front row again. The famous pianist stood, clapping slowly, deliberately. There was no smirk, no condescension. Only a nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition that something remarkable had happened. The young pianist's chest swelled, not with pride over winning approval, but with the knowledge that she had faced her fears, conquered doubt, and shared herself fully with the world, backstage. After the performance, people came to congratulate her. Some were teachers, some were fellow musicians, some were students who had watched her journey quietly. Everyone wanted to know how she had done it, how she had poured so much feeling into the music. She smiled, quietly explaining that it had been a journey of practice, perseverance, and belief in herself. She didn't need to tell them about the mocking words from months ago. Those were already part of the story her music had told. Later that night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement, she thought about how much she had changed. The girl who had trembled on stage months ago seemed like a distant memory. Now she felt a calm, quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from truly knowing yourself and trusting your own voice. She realized that this performance was more than a success. It was a transformation. The young pianist knew that there would be more challenges ahead. The world of music was full of critics, comparisons, and expectations. But she also knew that she had discovered a secret that no one could take away: her courage, her honesty, and her ability to connect with others through her music. That knowledge would carry her through anything. As she entered her apartment that night, she sat at her piano again, not to practice, but to reflect. She played a few gentle notes, feeling the echoes of the audience and the hall still lingering in her mind. Each note reminded her of the journey she had traveled, the fear she had faced, and the strength she had found. And she smiled, knowing that she was ready for whatever came next. She understood, finally, that the power of music wasn't just in the notes themselves. It was in the emotion, the story, and the courage behind them. Every person who had listened that night had not just heard her play, they had felt her journey, her determination, and her heart. And in that realization, she found something even greater than applause or recognition. She had found herself for the first time. She didn't need to think about the famous pianist or the whispers of judgment that had haunted her. They were no longer chains holding her back. They were reminders of what she had overcome. She had faced fear, failure, and doubt, and she had risen. And in doing so, she had discovered a truth that would guide her for the rest of her life. When you play with honesty, courage, and heart, one song can indeed change everything.